Now, of course, you're here to talk about the review of the court system, which is obviously a very important story that I'm keen to get your take on. But I did just want to start off by talking about the case of Sara Sharif, because it feels to me that very rarely, these cases come along that just knock you off your stride. And the questions are always asked about, what can we learn, what can be done, what do we need to change so this can't happen again? And I just wondered what your reaction is to the abuse and the murder of that little girl.
It's absolutely appalling. It's incredibly heartbreaking and tragic, and to think of the abuse that little girl suffered. I'm glad that she's had a modicum of justice with the conviction for murder of both her father and stepmother, but it's absolutely unthinkable and hard to find the words. And then from the point of view of government, there will be a safeguarding review into the involvement of public agencies that had involvement with Sara, and to see what lessons can be learned from that. But today is really about this little girl who's tragically lost her life at the hands of the very people that should have been looking after her. Like
you say, I'm sure there will be a full review into all aspects of the case. But the one thing that I'm really struggling to get my head around is that she was allowed to be taken out of school. So the teachers reported it to social services, and then, well, we assume, perhaps as a result of that, her dad then takes her out of school to homeschool her. I mean, I use the word homeschool lightly, because let's be honest, that's not what he took. He was
abusing her.
He took her out of her school to get away with abusing her, right?
Yeah.
How can that be possible?
I mean, one of the things that this government is committed to do, and we're announcing plans shortly, is a safeguarding review looking at wholesale reform of children's social care. One of the things we'll be looking into is what further safeguards we can make for children, because protecting children has got to be a #1 priority for any government, and in particular those children that are homeschooled. If, as you say, that's not what was happening here, to make sure there are things like requirements for home inspections, to make sure that there's a register of all children, that we know which children are being homeschooled, and making sure they're properly safeguarded.
Minimum. I mean, surely there should be a register on homeschooling. That feels like just something that should just automatically happen.
I entirely agree, and this government is committed to exactly that. That's an absolute bare minimum, and we may need to go further in terms of providing safeguards precisely that we don't see more cases like this tragedy that Sara experienced.
I guess the thing as well that I'm struggling with, I'm sure many people are struggling with, is we have these horrific cases of child abuse, and we just hear the same things, that lessons will be learned, that it should never happen again, and then it does happen again.
It's appalling. It's an absolute tragedy, and it's evil, right? What we've seen is the fact that the very people that should have been taking care of Sara inflicted, in the end, fatal injuries on her. It is disgusting, but you're right, the role of government is to learn those systemic lessons, and we've got to do that to avoid this tragedy in future. And I don't want to be back here, or any member of the government wants to be back here sat talking to you to see any repeat of this. So we've got to learn those lessons. I'm not going to preempt what the review will recommend, but it's got to be looking across the whole system, every single agency, whether it's police, local authorities, schools, courts, the lot, so that we can avoid such tragedies in future.
OK. You're here because you are launching a review of the criminal courts. Just tell me what the idea is.
So the context for this is that we have our criminal court system that is in crisis. We've inherited a system where there is a backlog of cases that is at record levels, and it's rising. And what this means is that we simply cannot deliver swift justice for victims. We've got some victims that, maybe in some of the most serious cases for rape or serious sexual violence, that may be waiting as late as 2027 to see their day in court. That's the consequence of the crisis in our criminal courts.
What kind of thing does that mean? I guess that means witnesses, pulling out, it means evidence going cold, and obviously the victims living with the abuse, right?
That's exactly right. So take a victim of rape who may be waiting 1, 2, 3 years for her trial to come to court. You're living with the psychological harm. You cannot get justice, you cannot get closure. And what we're seeing is a number of those victims are actually pulling out of the process, which is actually leading to some of those trials collapsing altogether, which is not only failing to deliver justice delayed is justice denied, but it's also deeply inefficient. And so as a consequence, this government is gripping the crisis like the previous government completely failed to do. We've already taken first steps. We've added 500 court sitting days to increase the capacity. We've extended magistrate sentencing powers. What that means is it will free up up capacity in the Crown Court to deal with the most serious cases, transferring less serious cases to the magistrates. But that's not going to be enough. We need bold reform, and that's why we've asked today Sir Brian Leveson to look at the full range of options for how we grip the crisis in our criminal justice system.
I was struck by this bit. You said the review will also look at where technology can be used to drive efficiency and improve how the court functions. Are you looking at AI being used in the court system?
Technology and looking at efficiency will be a very important part of it, but I think what we're asking Sir Brian to look at in this first phase is fundamental reform of things like the classification of offences, whether we need to be looking at extending magistrates' sentencing powers.
But you are considering AI, right? I mean, people say this is a kind of revolutionary thing that could speed everything up. Is that what you're looking at here?
To deliver the absolute prerequisite requirement of a fair trial, we will always have human involvement, whether that's judges, whether that's juries. That's always going to be important. But where we can deploy technology to increase efficiency in terms of case management systems and all of that, it's right that we look at that as part of the mix as well.
And AI is included, when you say technology, that means AI as well. I'm just trying to be clear.
Absolutely. AI has got to be part of the mix in terms of that efficiency review, and Sir Brian has included that within the scope of his review.
You are very frank in saying that this is a court system in crisis. At the same time, you know, many people will look at funding of the courts, and the Ministry of Justice hasn't been historically a protected department like schools, like the NHS, and it isn't now, right? Rachel Reeves has also asked you to look at your departments to find 5% of efficiency savings. I mean, is that possible in a department that you admit is in crisis?
We've inherited a crisis from the previous government.
You've made that point already. You've made that point already. What I'm asking about right now, is it possible to cut 5% from your department?
Well, we need to live with the fiscal reality and the fiscal inheritance that we've had from the previous government, the 22 billion black hole, which is important to talk about.
You've got it out there. You've got it out there.
But it's important when we're talking about today that even if we were to run the Crown Court system at absolute capacity, at its maximum capacity, that would still fail to keep up with the level of demand that's coming into the system. And that's a really important fact, because what we need to look at is pretty fundamental reform. And that's why what we've said to Sir Brian Leveson is we've got to deal with the fiscal reality, but the sorts of reforms we're looking at, things like reclassification of offences, whether we should be extending magistrates' powers and taking out some of those cases from the Crown Court into the lower courts, whether we need to look at something like an intermediate court for certain offences. That's not about necessarily spending extra money, but it is about the sort of reform that is going to deliver swifter justice for victims.